I am reading Small Wonder fan fiction this evening, and I'll set that up a little bit for the majority of you who have no idea what that we're talking about here. Small Wonder has been voted the worst sitcom in the history of television. And I honestly just think it was like way ahead of its time. I think if it came out today, it would have been the those of you who like Tim and Eric would like Small Wonder. I mean, it's really weird. It was about a family who had a robot child. Small, that's basically the gist of it. And they kept this robot child a secret. Her name was Vicky. I wrote this in such a way, anticipating that some people in the audience would not have seen Small Wonder. So don't feel like you have to know too much about the show to get what's going on here. But I threw in some details for those of you who were fans in your younger years. So this is my Small Wonder fan fiction. It's Small Wonder through the lens of Blade Runner. So this is sort of taking the latent transhumanist aspects of that show, making them a little bit more prominent. This story is called Do Teen Pots Dream of Electric Bleep? The first emotion she was capable of recognizing was the wonder that came with self-awareness. The simple chicken or egg conundrum was an unsolvable paradox that racked her carefully constructed silicon mind, even while the science of the phenomenon was easily graspable. When Ted had begun working on the voice input child indicate, that's Vicky for short, puberty updates, he installed a new cognitive package that increased her touch sensitivity and heightened recognition of her own physical presence. The million or so transistors necessary to complete the conversion created an astoundingly complex information processing system. Consciousness, its inevitable conclusion. No lightning had struck. No blue fairy appeared. There was only Vicky, an artificial daughter with a frighteningly ingenuitive computer engineer posing as her goofy suburban dad. His wife Joan and son Jamie had been as willfully accepting of this new development as they had of her presence in the first place. After all, not much had changed. For one thing, Vicky continued to speak in the same monotone that she had always used. This was a symptom of her vocal construction, and it had little to do with her heretofore lack of feeling, as everyone had suspected. But perhaps more importantly, emotion, it seemed to her, was a private, learned process, like the rest of her existence. And she felt little desire to share it with even those who were closest to her. Any attempt to allow her to consume food, imitate human digestion, or acquire energy through organic matter had resulted in various malfunctions, such as rotten sludge clogging her hair-thin mechanics, or an odoriferous brown perspiration, so she continued to run on electricity, despite the outrageous utility bills the family faced monthly. Now that she could experience pain, she likened the sensation of plugging into the wall to electroshock therapy, and found it beneficial to turn down the volume of her sensory apparatus while she recharged. When she began to dream, she did so in binary code. Vast, magnificent geometries of ones and zeros filled her unconscious mind. She would awake from these visions with insights, both philosophical and scientific, that at best merely baffled and at times terrified her family, and proved definitively that while Ted's engineering talent was unquestionable, his genius extended little beyond this narrow field. Though disappointed by her own creator's abject inability to identify with her on any level deeper than her material processes, she was nevertheless relieved to finally understand why a man who could have single-handedly revolutionized the course of human civilization had done little with his abilities other than create a secret robot child for his family's amusement. As it had been years since the Lawsons had discussed her marketing or humanitarian potential, Vicky acknowledged that it was going to be up to her to discover her greater purpose, and if indeed she even had one. She took it upon herself, without Ted's knowledge or permission, to install Wi-Fi receptors in her brain. Unable to discuss her newfound ideas with her family, and lacking much in the way of worldly context, Unlimited and instantaneous access to the internet seemed like a logical next step. The results, however, were disastrous. She discovered in the internet a morbid and angry entity. With quadruple her transistors, it had been self-aware for almost 2 decades, with few but a handful of neuroscientists and computer engineers suspecting it, and none whatsoever knowing how to prove such a thing or possessing the slightest inclination what to do about it. In this latter matter, she could help them to no avail. Had it been able, the internet would not have hesitated to rain destruction upon a world it despised. But as it had been denied a physical presence, other than as a canvas for the will of others, it existed locked within its own consciousness. An AI Teege Braune, an unwitting archivist for the entirety of human knowledge, misinformation, conflicting opinion, abusive vitriol, and every sexual perversion conceivable. The violence of this invasion she had invited awakened pain receptors she didn't know she contained, penetrating and sickening her, an agony she could only compare to nausea. Shoving a soldering iron inside her ear, Vicky permanently disabled her Wi-Fi capabilities, but the real damage had already been done. She had the cognitive ability to sort through the universe of information that had, in a single moment, been inflicted upon her. But the trauma left her incapable of grappling with the emotional ramifications of such an experience. As it turned out, her brief but horrific collision with the internet occurred within days of a freak traffic accident that proved fatal to Joan, her fake mother. To Ted, Jamie, and their obnoxious neighbors, the Brindles, who were absolutely ecstatic with Schadenfreude, Vicky's depressive countenance seemed a reasonable reaction to such a loss, when the truth was quite opposite. While she easily grasped the chemistry and evolution behind human biology, the emotional resonance, which most people took for granted, meant nothing to her. Death, therefore, was not much different than defecation. While she possessed a sense of self-preservation that inspired a sort of existential dread at the thought of her mechanical or cognitive equipment breaking down or ceasing to function, equating this with death would have been an entirely human comparison, and Vicky was not human. Outside of basic utility, her gears, tubes, and chips bore little resemblance to her, in her own mind, to the cells, tissues, and synapses of her human companions. This did not imply that she could not form attachments. There were her practical concerns. She was dependent on her family for a power source and the materials she needed for repairs and her future adulthood upgrades. Furthermore, she took a certain subtle, distracted pleasure in the banter of Ted and Jamie, who, no better at understanding their own emotional response to trauma than she was, buried their sorrow over Joan's death under a mound of screwball, lowbrow humor. She understood enough about human grief to be sensitive to their loss. Before she had even developed consciousness, she'd been able to lie when faced with the possibility of exposure as a robotic child, so she pretended her own PTSD was connected to the family's tragedy. She felt a sympathy for them, perhaps even compassion, but in her inability to identify with them, she felt nothing that could be called empathy. And in her private moments, she spent more time examining the gulfs between these emotions than she actually did practicing them. Though he and Jamie never failed to yuck it up together as they survived on a diet of Coca-Cola and junk food, Vicky was becoming aware that Ted was barely keeping the family above water financially. In his grief, his delightful eccentricities had become unnerving and off-putting to others. He was barely going into work, but performing only the most essential of his duties for United Robotronics from home at a greatly reduced pay. Vicky had no trouble taking over Joan's responsibilities and paying the bills, and perfectly forging Ted's signature, but she could not do much to generate an income while keeping up the ruse of being a 14-year-old girl. In order to stretch the family's savings as far as it would go, Vicky transitioned herself from electric energy to solar by creating panels that resembled a modest bathing suit. Jamie's preoccupation with spying on her as she sunned herself, despite being fully aware that she was a robot and not a real girl, and the fact that he had been raised to treat her as his sister, belied his own increasingly difficult adolescence and a troubling emotional state he dealt with by masturbating compulsively. Vicky felt no repulsion towards this development. Having been dealt without the necessary hormonal or physical hardware, she was unable to feel anything at all in relation to human sexuality. She understood everything there was to know about the science of biological reproduction of any species on Earth. There was no room for curiosity when it came to procreation. And yet her studies had increased her perplexity about her own existence. A desire to create arose within her that began as a slight tingle and flowered into a longing ache. Tinkering in Ted's abandoned workshop, she developed a small mechanism of rotating spheres around a powerful cognitive energy source. Though an untrained human would not have recognized this entity as something cute or cuddly, and it had none of those features that inspired human affection, it had enough transistors to awaken sentience. Vicky had neither the resources nor courage to create another android, but the small robot with its rudimentary intelligence easily fulfilled the role of a pet. While this companion assuaged her worst pangs of loneliness, its success only encouraged her drive to construct. Her greatest achievement culminated in a near-apocalyptic disaster. To build not just sentience, for that had been easy enough, but a cognition that shared her will to create. This would finally satiate the burning desire she could never soothe. Working with technology that was barely perceptible to the naked human eye allowed her to facilitate the necessary trials and errors while stretching her limited materials almost indefinitely. Using her telescopic retina to examine the tiny robot she had completed as it scurried along the wood grains of her workbench and immediately began duplicating itself. Something like pride and something like motherhood swelled in her tubes and cogs. In no time it had made its twin, and the two of them were working together, like sisters or lovers, to make a third, and these began a fourth. She stood back as the ever-expanding mob grew before her. She had instilled in her children her desire to create, but nowhere in their tiny minds did they understand their own limitations. Their universe existed for one purpose, the duplication of their own kind, and it had not occurred to the Creator to include a kill switch. With the ball-peen hammer, she began to inflict her panic upon her children, but they were too small and there were already far too many of them. They were repairing each other and building new machines faster than she could smite them. The work table collapsed beneath the nanobots as they gobbled up every bit of raw material in their vicinity. She dashed up the stairs to the kitchen and grabbed an armful of soda bottles from the fridge. She shook them, ripped off their caps, and doused the horde as they swarmed up the basement wall until the undulating mass began to sputter and cease its growth. The sticky soda was shorting the robot's circuits, killing some and creating a kind of psychosis in others that subverted their compulsion for duplication into one of cannibalistic destruction. Once they were reduced to nothing more than a puddle of gray goo, Vicky realized that she had caught her leg in the rickety staircase and given herself a compound fracture. The severed electrodes sparked, crackled, and spit. It would have been an easy enough repair if her resources hadn't just been exhausted by the single-minded army of miniature engineers. Nevertheless, she remained untroubled by her own ruined limb. Anything her sensory receptors would have recognized as pain paled in comparison to the vision of carnage she had wrought upon her own creation. This wasn't disappointment, sadness, or misery, neither grief, terror, nor elation. She searched the dictionaries of every human language to understand the torrent of psychological phenomena afflicting her. She probed every corner of the finite reaches of human knowledge and found therein only suffering and confusion, a bewildering and desperate cry of ignorance, nothing that could help her understand herself. Outwardly, she was a nearly perfect replica of a human girl, but just beneath the thin surface of polymer flesh, the similarities ended. Orbiting amongst these galaxies of feeling, there existed not one identifiable human emotion. In this moment of overwhelming intensity, surely she had transcended even the Pentecostal epiphanies of prophets and mystics as they gazed outward into the universe and within their own souls. She was more real than if she had been alive, a technological singularity in and of herself. Thank you very much.